Okay, this is Professor Hazara, and we're starting the third week, Module 3 of the book and Module 3 of the course, in a sense. And this week we're going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to cover some of the stuff that's talked about in the chapter, but just the first half of the chapter, which talks about profitability, extending, basically it's very easy, extending return on assets and return on shareholders' equity into more meaningful ratios, and doing something with the cash conversion ratio. That's the first part. Second part, we're actually going to do something that's outside the book, but we're going to start working on, which is valuation. And we're going to do more and more on valuation as we go on. So we're going to do two things. Number one, kind of extend these ratios here that we've already done. And I'm doing it for Microsoft. That's my example. And then you'll do it for Apple on Brightspace. And then I'm going to also show you how to do a short form valuation, which is over here. Okay, there's going to be two videos on extending these ratios. Maybe one. We'll see how fast it goes, and then we'll do the valuation, the short form valuation, very cheap valuation, let's say. Okay, so these ratios, if you read the chapter, they talk about what is called the DuPont model. I think any course on financial statement analysis should have this. And basically, this is just a breakdown of return on assets and return on shareholders' equity into, let's say, more meaningful information. Okay, now in previous videos, and I'll upload this worksheet. I'll give you this worksheet when I do the class, when the assignment is there. Um, I've been using the Microsoft example of Microsoft as an example for the ratios. Hopefully, I'm catching all my lines right. Now, the return on assets. This is 2020 here, and this is 2019. In 2020, Microsoft had return on assets ratio of about 16%, return on shareholders' equity of 40%, and more or less the same things um, for a return on for 2019. So what I'm going to do is the traditional way of looking at these ratios is to break them down, especially start with return on assets. Return on assets for Microsoft, I'm just going to repeat the calculations and then show you how it's broken down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute basic return on assets without the analyst adjustment of adding back interest expense and net of taxes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take net income over average assets, which gives you a basic measure of return on assets. So let's say for 2020, it'll be slightly different than what I calculated up here because I haven't taken out the interest expense. So interest expense, let's see, for Microsoft for 2020 was $25.91. Your average assets, now I just have to go up here. Your average assets on return on shareholders' equity was 293, 933. Okay, so um, let's get that net income right. The net income, sorry for pausing there. That was an amazement. Okay, so basic return on assets without considering the adjustment for interest expense was 15% in 2020, and then for 2019, it'll be, I'll just pull net income here from earnings per share, and I'll pull average total assets out from the return on assets. So your basic return on assets for 2020 was 15.06% and 14.39%. Now, the way this is looked at sometimes is DuPont many years ago started breaking down return on assets. So your basic return on assets equation is net income divided by average assets. Now, return on assets can also be broken down into two components. This is the way that DuPont started doing it, and this was years ago, but it's still very much accepted. Is return on assets, they broke it down. You still get the same result, but they broke it down between your profit margin and your asset total. So they're saying that return on assets can measure in terms of how much you make, which is your profit margin, and how many times you make it, which is your asset turnover. So obviously, you want each one of these things to be high. This, in a sense, is your profitability, and this, in a sense, is your productivity. So let's go ahead and measure these things for Microsoft for 2020. And you'll notice that you'll get the same numbers because you'll notice that the sales cancel out, and you just get income divided by average assets. But if you break it down like this, it'll give you an idea of how much you're making and how many times you're making it, which you can see certain things. Now, for Microsoft, as you can see, it doesn't make much of a difference. I haven't done this for Apple yet, but since they have so much debt when we get to return on shareholders' equity, it seems to me that it might make a difference. Okay, so profit margin is net income. So net income is this number here divided by sales. Now sales, I can just pull it from the the well, I have all the numbers here. Just take it from account receivable turnover. Those are your total sales. Okay, so um, your profit margin was 30.96%, and your asset turnover is sales, which is just that number right there, divided by your average assets, which we know is uh, this number right here. We're just breaking down the same number. So you'll notice that you get the same number, 15.06%. However, and it's not going to be that big a deal now. I'm just wondering about Apple. Is that 15.6% is that you're making a margin of about 31% and turning it over 48.66%. So the higher each one of those, you'd want to compare several years of this. So the higher each one of those, the better. Let's compute those for 2019. I don't think you get much difference here. This is the calculations. So net income, we can just take it from right there. Then your sales, let's just go ahead and take it from the 2019 accounts receivable turnover. Your sales are 125, and then your sales here, asset turnover is 125, and your average assets are 272. So your profit margin was 31%. It's about the same for both years, and your turnover was slightly lower in 2019. So you got their ROA went up in 2020. It was almost totally due to efficiency rather than profitability. You can make that conclusion because the turnover went up from 46 to 48%. So turnover went up by that amount. Okay, so that's one extension. So that's how you extend return on assets. Now you can also, there's also an extension to return on shareholders' equity. And this extension is based on the concept we've been talking about all along, that the major difference between return on assets and return on shareholders' equity is the amount of long-term, long-term debt you have, but especially long-term debt. We'll take total debt here. So let's just repeat the numbers that we have for return on shareholders' equity up here. For it's net income divided by average shareholders' equity. I'm just bringing them down for convenience purposes. Okay, so we had return on shareholders' equity of 40.14 in 2020, and we have a for 2019 we have a return on shareholders' equity of net income of 39,000 divided by average shareholders' equity of 92,000 gives you 42.41, which is what you get. So far, those are I'm just repeating the numbers. Now, return on shareholders' equity, the big difference, as we've said, is the big difference is the amount of debt you take out. So your return on assets basically is your base number, and the more debt you take out, the higher return on shareholders' equity you get. If you have zero debt, your return on shareholders' equity and return on assets are exactly the same. But the more you take out, your return on assets stay the same, but the more debt you have, the larger your return on shareholders' equity gets. So therefore, return on shareholders' equity can be broken down into two components. One is just simply return on assets. The other one is you take that times financial leverage, which are your average assets divided by your average shareholders' equity. And they'll give you the same number because you'll notice if you take the product, the average assets cancels out. But it tells you how much of an influence financial leverage is having on the difference between return on shareholders' equity and return on assets. And financial leverage actually can be 1, 2, 3 times amounts. And there's other ways to compute and other meanings regarding financial leverage, which we may or may not get into, which have more of a managerial accounting perspective. So let's get our return on assets here first for 2020. We know our return on assets was net income divided by average assets. So your return on assets was 15.06. Now your financial leverage is your average assets, which is that number right there, divided by your average shareholders' equity, which is this number right here. So that's 2.666. So basically, your return on shareholders' equity is the financial leverage is over 2. So that means that it's going to basically be your shareholder return on shareholders' equity is going to be 2.66 times your return on assets. So in this case, you got a lot of debt there that's driving the rather large difference between your 16% return on assets, I believe, or 15% return on assets, and your 40% return on shareholders' equity. And that tells you something. And that's not a fatal sign or anything, but these things are things that can pick up red flags. And then finally, return on assets. Let's do the same thing for 2019. Your net income, your return on assets, as we know for 2019, was net income right here divided by your total assets, your average assets, your average total assets right there, which is gives you the 14.39. Okay, that number we've already done. But let's see the impact of financial leverage, which is your average assets, okay, and then your average shareholders' equity, which is right there, okay, which is 2.95. So uh, this number, return on shareholders' equity, stayed the same. The reason it went down, well, it did go down, but that's not chump change. 2 percentage points, not chump change. But the reason it went down is because the level of your financial leverage went down. Here, in this case, you actually had good return on assets, uh, and I guess they paid off some debt, a little bit of debt or something, but the financial leverage only made return on shareholders' equity 2.66 times return on assets. Here it was close to 3. So that's how you break these things down. And the final breakdown is you use these concepts I just shown you, and those concepts are used to sort of break down return on shareholders' equity. Now we're going to get the same return on shareholders' equity that we've got up here. We're going to get 40.14% here, and we're going to get 42.41% here. But we're just going to take 3 numbers. We're going to take return on assets, which is profit margin times asset turnover. That's what we just did. And take it times financial leverage. So you can take 3 components, break them down, with these 2 being return on assets, and take it times financial leverage. Okay, so return on assets. Your return on assets is your 2020 profit margin. I'm going to go up to here. This is for 2020. 30.96. Your asset turnover is 48.66, and your financial leverage is 2.66, and this number is profit margin times asset turnover times 2.66 financial leverage, which gives you your return on shareholders' equity for 2020, and then for 2019 is you get return on assets of your profit margin is 31%. For a high-tech company, that's not necessarily that big. And then your asset turnover is 46.15%. And finally, your um, your financial leverage is 2.95. Okay, and so your um, return on shareholders' equity is that right there. Now, what is this telling you? Not that much for Microsoft, not that much change, but it is telling you that their return on assets is pretty good, but they have almost 3 times the level of 3 closing it on 3 for both years in a sense, um, times the re, uh, the return on shareholders' equity is 3 times return on assets because of all the debt they have. Is that a problem? Not necessarily, as long as it can pay it off. Would it be a problem if it got higher? Microsoft's a pretty good company. I doubt it. But, these are just things you want to take a closer look at to see what. And my question is, what are they spending their money on? If they're using it to invest in this wonderful company, great. If they're invested and if they're paying dividends with it and going down that direction, which I don't think they necessarily need to because they've got such great cash flow, well, that's a different story. But not a big deal. Just ways of raising flags. But the major thing is return on assets can be broken down between profit margin, which is how much you make, and asset turnover, which is basically how many times you turn it over, and your efficiency in a sense. And then if you take return on assets and multiply it times financial leverage, that really is the big difference between return on assets and return on shareholders' equity. And for Microsoft, it this financial leverage means that they're going to have return on shareholders' equity more or less 3 times what the return on assets is. But the return on assets is actually pretty good. So anyway, so that's this video. I'll post it, and you'll probably have to do the same thing with Apple. Guess what? We're creating these things. And then the next video is going to be on the cash conversion cycle, which is going to be a very short video. And the final, then we're going to have a series of 4 videos where we're actually going to do a stock valuation, a very basic, about rudimentary and back of the envelope and crude stock valuation for Microsoft, which you will do for Apple. And then we'll get back into, and then we're going to get into doing more fancy valuations and refine them as we go along. Okay, so I'll post this video, and then I'll